In this lesson, we'll talk about mesh visibility and also talk about polygroups. So I've just got a simple sphere loaded up, and we'll use this as our initial example to talk about polygroups. So one of the cool things about ZBrush is the ability to hide different parts of our model so that we can focus on certain areas. So if we want to, for instance, only focus on part of this sphere, of this low resolution polygons, and I've got it very low res so that we can see the actual polygons and what's visible and what's not. It works at high resolutions as well. We want to hold down Control and Shift at the same time. That'll bring up our select rectangle in here. And what we can do with this is decide which polygons we want to actually be able to see in our canvas and which ones we want to be invisible. So holding down Control and Shift, I can drag out a rectangular marquee. And you can see that right now it's green. So when it's green, anything inside of this, when I let off, is going to be visible, and anything that's not inside it's going to be invisible. So you can see anything that was completely inside that green marquee is visible, and anything that wasn't is now invisible. And you can see some of those polygons here. If I hold down Control and Shift and click in the canvas, it'll bring all of that back. So that detail, those polygons are still there, they are just invisible. So again, I can come in, come down here, you can see part of this is visible. If I hold down Control and Shift and drag, that'll invert the visibility. So the portion that was visible is now invisible, and vice versa. Now if I go ahead and show everything, I can also, when I drag out that rectangle, if I now hold down Alt, it's going to change to red, and that's just going to do the opposite. So let's say I just want to hide the end of the sphere, I can hold down the red, and whatever I let go, that'll just hide everything. And then everything else is the same. I can switch it up, or I can show everything. Okay? Now once you have some of your mesh invisible, you can, for instance, come in and under Geometry and under Modify Topology, you could say, okay, I want to delete whatever's hidden. So that's a good way of deleting polygons if you just hide them, and then you can delete anything that's hidden from your mesh. So if you wanted to just get rid of this, make it an open model, you could delete those polygons. Okay. Now another way to organize and be able to real quickly turn off and on the visibility of our polygons is to use polygroups. So polygroups are just basically a way of creating different kinds of selection masks for our polygons. So right now you can see with polyframe on, this entire sphere is blue. And the colors are what's going to indicate the different polygroups. So we'll be able to see those when we have polyframe on. So for instance, I could come in here and I'll just select the front of this sphere. And if we come down to the polygroups subgroup, there are a number of ways that we can create polygroups. One of the quickest ways is just to hit Control W, and that will create a polygroup out of whatever is visible. Okay. You can also come in here, you can say Group Visible Polygons. Okay, and you have some coverage and cluster items. You also have auto groups, which if you have a bunch of different objects, it'll group those by the different shells that you have. You can also merge things that are similar. You have the ability to group mask, which we'll look at in a second. So from polypaint, from masking, a lot of different ways to create polygroups. So now if I go ahead and show the rest of that, you can see that this is now separate from this. Now the only thing that is disconnected about this is the grouping. So these points are not, disconnected. The model is still the same. If we had sculpted detail on here, it would still be the same. And if we had polyframe off, it would look exactly the same. The difference is now I can go ahead and hit Control Shift, and if I just click on a point on that polygroup, I can just isolate that polygroup. So for instance, if I had several polygroups, I come in here and make that a polygroup. So now I've got 3 polygroups. If I Control Shift click on this blue one, it isolates that, makes it the only one visible. So it turns everything else off. I can invert that if I want to. Come back in. So if I click on this once, it shows just this one. If I Control Shift click on it again, it'll bring everything else back and make that one invisible. So you can kind of cycle through depending on what it is that you want to actually be able to see versus the kind of the polygroups that you have assigned here. Now this also works at higher levels. So if I go ahead and let's increase our subdivision levels here, I can come in and actually select polygons this way. So if I come in here like this, you can see I'm now selecting a large number of polygons. A Control W again will go ahead and allow me to create a new polygroup there, and I can hide and isolate that. I can also create a mask, so come in here and create a mask. And if I hit Control W, I can actually create a polygroup based on that particular mask. Now another cool thing that you can do here is under polygroups, we've got group mask, there's a polish slider. If we just turn this polish slider up just a little bit and now do our group mask, you can see it actually creates a sharper line there if you increase that polish amount. Let's increase that just a hair. Actually got rid of it all. So you can see that and now we can isolate that. And there's a lot of different things that we can do once we have our polygroups assigned. Another way that we can create new polygroups is to use the slice curve. And so we can come in here and select slice curve, and then we come in here and perhaps at some sort of an angle come in and group that, and I want to go ahead and delete our subdivision levels. We can come in here and create new polygroups that way. So wherever I'm slicing, that's creating new polygroups, which is kind of a quick way to come in and create new polygroups. So that works as well. Okay, and a lot of the functions that you do in ZBrush are going to end up creating polygroups. Things like panel loops and some of the hard surface stuff will create new groups when you perform those actions. Just keep in mind that you'll only be able to see those when you have your polyframe turned on. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at kind of a little bit more of a practical example. Well, first let's go ahead and I'll just show you this. So I've hidden this little section of polygroup. If I hit delete hidden, then those polygons are gone. I've deleted those out. Anything that was in that polygroup that I hid is gone and deleted from my mesh. So if you need to do that, that's available to you. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a sphere, and let's make this a polymesh. And first we'll look at initialize, and I've got this set to 36 by 24, so something pretty low res. So let's make this a polymesh. And so what I want to do now is just create a separate polymesh for the kind of the front of this eye. So I'm going to come in here. I want to make sure that I go back and select the rectangle here, and I'll go ahead and create a new polygroup. Sometimes the colors that it creates for the polygroups aren't too different from the colors you already have, so at any time you can go in and just toggle through, create another polygroup, and it'll switch to another color. So now I've got that. I can go ahead and hide this. I can also, if I want to, come in and delete polygons from there. Go ahead and polygroup that. So now I've got 3 polygroups here. Okay, I can, now that I've got this separated out into different polygroups, I can use move. I'll click on that point right there, and that'll align the transpose line with that. And if I control click on that polygroup with transpose or with the move selected, I can actually mask off the other polygroups. So let me go ahead and mask it. There we go. And so now what I can do is hit move, and I'll hit shift, and now I can move this one back in along that transpose line. So I'm moving it straight back and in. Okay, so I can create something along those lines, and then I can unmask it. Now I can come in and let's say I hide this middle one, and I'm going to come into the subtool subpalette. We haven't really talked about subtools yet, but we will get to it. There's just a lot of information to cover here in ZBrush. But in the subtool subpalette, we're going to look at split, and here it will allow us to split hidden. So if I hit that, that's actually made that pupil a separate piece of geometry, a separate subtool. So we've got one subtool here with multiple polygroups, and then we split one of the polygroups off into its own subtool. So this is the list where we'll be able to keep all the different pieces of geometry that we have in our model. Okay, so at this point we can come in here and I can hide this. So we've got this selected, and now when I smooth out the model, I want this to remain sharp. So I'm going to go ahead and come into geometry, and let's open up edge loop. So what I want to do is create an edge loop along these edges, and I'll choose crisp. I'll create an edge loop, and you can see that it actually creates a new polygroup on that side. And so I'm going to go ahead and group that together, and then we'll show. So now when I subdivide this, that edge remains fairly sharp. We'll turn off polygroup. So we get something like that, which we can use as an eye for a character. On this piece, we can go ahead and decide that we want to use our deformation to kind of move it back. And we turn on our floor. Okay, we can kind of move it and offset it a little bit. Let's move it back in the Z. And I want to increase the size a little bit and just offset it a bit. And that'll give us our sort of inner pupil. But the polygroups, and this is a very simple example, the polygroups make it much easier to organize and kind of deal with the polygons on your model, because you've got them to where you can very quickly select different selections that you've decided on, very quickly see some and then have others invisible, and then do some functions on those and have it not affect the ones that are invisible. So, and even when you're sculpting and you have a model that's very high resolution, you have a lot of detail in it, and you only want to be able to see a certain part of it. You don't want the other parts to kind of get in the way of what you're doing. You can use it for that as well, kind of turn off the visibility of those certain subtools. You'll find if you build kind of a character, maybe you've got the arms and legs split into different polygroups. So definitely polygroups are going to be a big portion of what you do here in ZBrush, and so it's important to learn about those. So the next thing that we're going to just touch on is working with materials. So we talked about sort of adding materials, painting with materials. Let's take a look at some of the things that we can change about our materials and how we can start to add those to our models and matte caps and things like that. So we'll continue on this process learning about ZBrush by looking at materials in the next lesson.